Today we've got 16 fun, easy, and slightly evil chess traps for both white and black that can help you win games ridiculously fast. These are the kinds of traps where your opponent thinks they're completely fine, and then suddenly their queen disappears. Beautiful stuff.
Let's start with chess trap number 1. The game begins simply. White opens with a pawn to e4, and black responds with a pawn to e5. White pushes the pawn to d4, boldly challenging black's center, and if black takes on d4, bam! The stage is set for our trap. Next, white pushes the pawn to f3, inviting black to take again. Black captures on c3, and you might think white is losing control. But watch this. White develops the bishop to c4, and black gets greedy, capturing yet another pawn on b2. However, this is exactly what white wanted. The bishop swoops in and recaptures the pawn on b2, eyeing down the board dangerously. Black develops the knight on f6, attacking the pawn on e4, and white calmly moves his knight on c3. Now, black brings out the bishop to b4, pinning the knight, and white quietly maneuvers the knight to e2. Black, sensing an opportunity, captures the pawn on e4. White castles kingside, keeping the king safe, but black continues their attack, taking the knight on c3. Here, white recaptures with the other knight, and black castles kingside as well. Now comes the turning point. White's knight leads to d5, attacking the bishop. Black, trying to maintain pressure, develops their bishop to c5, but white seizes the moment and advances the knight to f6. If black captures with the queen, white has the perfect counter, capturing it with the bishop. So black wisely captures with the pawn instead. White responds by sliding the queen to g4, giving a check. Black has no choice but to move the king to h8. And here's where the trap tightens. White's queen moves to h4, setting up a threat of checkmate. Desperation sets in for black. They try to defend with the bishop on e7, but white calmly positions their bishop on d3, pointing directly on h7. Black brings the rook to g8, hoping for a miracle, but it's too late. White's queen swoops in, capturing the pawn on h7, and it's checkmate. Chess trap number 2. The game begins with white playing pawn to e4, and black responding with pawn to e5. White develops the knight to s3, attacking the e5 pawn, and black defends it with mate to c6. Next, white plays pawn to c3, aiming to control the center, while black develops the knight to f6, putting pressure on the e4 pawn. White then strikes with pawn to d4, and let's say black takes the bait, capturing the e4 pawn with the knight. Now, white advances the d5 pawn, attacking the black knight, and if he retreats to e7, white seizes the opportunity, capturing the pawn on e5. Black counters by advancing the pawn to d6, attacking the white knight. Here's where things heat up. White moves the bishop to b5, giving a check. Black tries to block by advancing the pawn to c6, but white takes it with the pawn, trying to open up the board. Black captures the knight on a5, but white captures the black pawn on b7 and giving a check. Black blocks with the bishop on d7, but white's bishop captures it and only moves the black queen to recapture the bishop. Now, white's pawn on b7 advances to a8 and promotes to a queen, setting the stage for the final blow. Black's queen moves to d8, desperately trying to defend. But white's newly promoted queen calmly moves to d8, delivering a checkmate. If instead black had tried to defend with the knight moving to c8, white could still capture the black queen on d7. After black recaptures with the king, white would remain in a dominating position. Chess trap number 3. The game begins with white advancing the pawn to e4, and black responds with pawn to c6, signaling the Caro-Kann defense. White immediately gains control of the center by pushing the pawn to d4, and black challenges it with the pawn to d5. White then pushes forward with pawn to e5, claiming more space, and black develops the bishop to f5, aiming to counter white's central control. At this point, white is gearing up for a kingside pawn storm, moving the pawn to h4. In this position, if black responds with pawn to e6, then here's the next moves to play. White pushes the pawn to g4, aggressively attacking the black bishop on s5. Black cannot capture this pawn as it is protected by the queen and moves to e4. But white isn't backing down. Pawn to f3 attacks the bishop again, and black retreats the bishop to g6. Now, white moves the pawn to h5, putting further pressure on the bishop. Black, feeling cornered, captures the pawn on h5. But white's rook on h1 swoops in, capturing the black bishop. Chess trap number 4. The game starts with white advancing the pawn to e4, and black responding symmetrically with pawn to e5, white knight to f3, and black knight to c6. White then moves the bishop to b5, attacking the black's knight. Black responds with pawn to a6, attacking the bishop, and white calmly retreats it to a4. Black plays pawn to d6, reinforcing the center. Now white strikes back by pushing the pawn to d4, challenging black's center. Black reacts with pawn to b5, attacking the bishop once again. White retreats the bishop to b3, maintaining its diagonal. The tension increases as black's knight captures and grabs the pawn on d4. But white responds by capturing the knight with their knight. Black then recaptures with the pawn. In this division, if white takes the pawn on d4 with the queen, he is now under a spell. Black, not backing down, plays pawn to c5, attacking the queen and forcing it to move. Instead of retreating, white boldly centralizes further with queen to d5, maintaining pressure plus a threat to black's rook. Black develops the bishop to e6, attacking the queen and gaining a tempo. White responds with the queen to c6 giving a check, hoping black moves his queen to d7 and capturing the rook on a8. But black calmly blocks the check by moving the bishop to d7 instead. White then retreats the queen back to d5, once again commanding the center and creating threats. Black decides to push the pawn to c4, and the white's bishop is now trapped. Chess trap number 5. White begins by developing the knight to f3, and black responds with a pawn to d5. Pawn to e4, and black captures the pawn on e4. Without hesitation, white moves the knight to g5, threatening immediate danger, and black responds by developing the knight to f6, defending the e4 pawn. White escalates the pressure by pushing the pawn to d3, challenging black's center. Black captures the pawn on d3, but white recaptures with the bishop, setting the stage for a clever combination. Sensing the looming threats, black plays pawn to h6, attacking the knight on g5 and forcing it to retreat. But here comes the fireworks. White sacrifices the knight by capturing the pawn on f7, with a threat on black queen and rook. Black then takes the knight with the king. White seizes the opportunity and moves the bishop to g6 with a check. Black captures the bishop with the king, but this is exactly what white wanted. Bam. White now delivers the decisive blow and captures the queen, and black now is queenless. You will now win the game if you play 100% accurately on the next following moves. Chess trap number 6. White begins by advancing the pawn to e4, and black responds symmetrically with pawn to e5. White knight to f3, while black develops the knight to c6. White continues with bishop to c4, and black develops the knight to f6. White evens the initiative by moving the knight to g5, directly threatening the f7 pawn. Black tries to diffuse the pressure by pushing the pawn to d5, attacking white's bishop and challenging the center. But white strikes back, capturing the pawn on d5. Black recaptures with the knight, seemingly stabilizing the position. However, white now captures the f7 pawn with the knight, and black takes the knight with the king, moving it to f7. This is where white launches the next wave of the attack, moving the queen to f3 and giving a check. Black moves the king to g8, seeking safety. But white isn't done yet, capturing the knight on d5 with the bishop with a check. Black responds by capturing the bishop on d5 with the queen, and white's capture it with the queen. Forced to block, black moves his bishop to e6. Finally, white delivers the crushing blow by capturing the bishop on e6, a beautiful checkmate. Chess trap number 7. This trap is interesting. White begins with pawn to d4, and black responds symmetrically with pawn to d5. White pawn to c4, and black solidifies with pawn to e6. White develops the knight to c3, increasing pressure, while black develops the knight to f6. White escalates by moving the bishop to g5, pinning black's f6 knight to the queen. Black responds with knight to g7. Seizing the opportunity, white captures the pawn on d5 with the c4 pawn. Black recaptures the pawn on d5 with the e6 pawn, maintaining the pawn structure. White then captures the d5 pawn with the knight, putting further pressure on Black's position. And here's the fun begins. Black captures the knight on d5 with their knight, and White quickly captures the queen with the bishop. Black then gives a check by placing the bishop on b4, and only move, White moves his queen to d2. Black captures the queen on d2, and White recaptures the bishop with the king. Finally, Black captures the bishop on d8 with the king, and he is now up a knight. Very interesting trap. Chess trap number 8. Another great trap. White starts by advancing the pawn to e4, staking a claim in the center, and Black mirrors with e5. White immediately challenges the center with pawn to d4, and Black accepts by capturing on d4. Next, White develops the knight to f3, pressuring the d4 pawn, and Black responds with pawn to c5, reinforcing their control. White brings the bishop to c4, eyeing the vulnerable s7 square, while Black develops the knight to c6, further solidifying the center. White castles kingside, ensuring the king's safety, and Black strengthens their structure with pawn to d6. White positions the rook to e1, preparing for potential central tactics, while Black develops the bishop to g4, pinning the f3 knight to the queen. White seizes the initiative by pushing pawn to e5, attacking Black's central pawn. Black recaptures the e5 pawn with the knight, and White makes the tactic and captures the knight on e5, leaving the queen. Black immediately captures the White's queen. However, White shifts the momentum with bishop to b5, delivering a check. If Black blocks with the queen, he will lose his queen. So Black moves the king to e7, but White lands the final blow by maneuvering the knight to d7, delivering a check in Black walks with bishop and its checkmate. Chess trap number 9. White begins by advancing the pawn to e4, taking control of the center, and Black responds with pawn to d5. White captures and Black recaptures with the queen, moving it to d5. To gain tempo, White develops the knight to c3, attacking the queen, and Black retreats the queen to d8. White follows up by pushing the pawn to d4, building a strong central presence, while Black develops the knight to c6. White develops the knight to s3, defending the pawn, and Black pins the knight with the bishop on g4, creating tension on the board. White strikes with pawn to d5, attacking the knight on c6. Black moves the knight to e5, attacking White's pinned knight on f3. White captures the e5 knight, and Black captures the queen on d1 immediately. But White counters tactically, moving the bishop to b5 and giving a check. Black blocks by pushing the pawn to ce6, but White captures it with the pawn, advancing their attack. Black shifts the queen to ce7. White continues by capturing the pawn on b7 with a check. Black escapes by moving the king to d8, but White isn't finished. The pawn on a7 promotes to a queen on a8, delivering a powerful discovered check. Black attempts to block by moving the queen to c8, but White captures it with their queen. Black recaptures with the king, moving to ce8, but now White calmly captures the bishop on d1. He is now up a pawn, a knight, and a bishop, a decisive material advantage. Chess trap number 10. This is a fun trap. White starts with the ambitious pawn push to f4, aiming to seize control of the center. Black counters by moving the pawn to e5, engaging in a direct challenge. White boldly captures the e5 pawn with the f4 pawn, creating immediate tension. Black responds with d6, targeting White's advanced e5 pawn. White takes the d6 pawn with the e5 pawn, threatening Black's structure. Black recaptures the pawn with the bishop, activating it on a strong diagonal. White plays g3, either to fianchetto a bishop or to solidify their position. Seizing the moment, Black moves the queen to g5, threatening the g3 pawn and initiating a tactical sequence. White develops the knight to f3, attacking Black's queen and preparing to defend. However, Black captures the g3 pawn with the queen, delivering a check and escalating the attack. White captures the queen with the h-pawn, thinking they have neutralized the threat. But Black reveals the devastating final move. The bishop captures on g3, delivering a stunning checkmate. Chess trap number 11. White begins by moving the pawn to d4, aiming for strong central control, and Black responds with the bold pawn push to e5. immediately challenging the center. White captures the e5 pawn, gaining the material advantage, but black quickly develops the knight to f6, putting pressure on the e5 pawn. White then develops the knight to f3, defending the pawn and stabilizing the center. Black moves the queen to e7, increasing the attack on the e5 pawn, so white develops the bishop to f4, reinforcing the defense. However, black plays queen to b4, delivering a check and forcing white to react. White blocks the check by moving the bishop to d2, but black seizes the opportunity to capture the b2 pawn with the queen, threatening white's rook on a 1. White calmly develops the bishop to c3, defending the rook while also attacking black's queen. Yet black develops the bishop to b4, pinning white's bishop to the king, creating a tense position. White moves the queen to d2, defending the bishop. However, black captures the bishop on c3 with the bishop, so white recaptures with the queen, maintaining material balance. But black finishes with a brilliant move, queen to c1, and delivering a stunning checkmate. Chess trap number 12. White begins with the pawn to e4, and black responds symmetrically with the pawn to e5. White develops the knight to s3, attacking black's e5 pawn, and black defends it by developing the knight to c6. Next, white moves the bishop to b5. Black counters with the knight to f6, attacking white's e4 pawn and setting up counterplay. White castles kingside for safety, but black advances the knight to g4, creating threats against white's position. In response, white pushes the pawn to h3, attacking the g4 knight, and black escalates the tension by pushing the pawn to h5, sacrificing the knight, preparing an aggressive king5 attack. White captures the knight with the pawn, and black recaptures with the h5 pawn, forcing white's knight into retreat to h2. Black seizes the initiative by moving the queen to h4, threatening mate on h2. White makes a breathing room for the king and moves the rook to e1, but black captures the knight with a check. White's king moves to f1 to escape, yet black continues the attack by developing the knight to d4, creating a dangerous threat. White tries to escape with the pawn to f3, but black pushes the pawn to g3, intensifying the assault on white's king. Despite white's attempts to reposition the rook for defense, black finishes the game with queen to h1, a stunning checkmate. Chess trap number 13. White begins by moving the pawn to e4, and black mirrors with e5. White develops the knight to f3, and black develops the knight to c6. White then develops the bishop to c4, targeting the vulnerable f7 square. Black is aggressive and moves the knight to d4. White seizes the opportunity to capture the free pawn on e5 with the knight, ramping up the pressure on black's position. Black, however, strikes back by moving the queen to g5, threatening white's knight and eyeing an attack. White doesn't back down and boldly captures the pawn on f7 with the knight, forking black's queen and rook. Black, instead of retreating, captures the pawn on g2 with the queen, attacking white's rook on h1 and setting up counterplay. White saves the rook and slides to f1, but black escalates by capturing the pawn on e4 with the queen, giving a check. White blocks the check by moving the bishop to e2, seemingly stabilizing the position. However, black delivers a stunning final blow with knight to f3, a devastating checkmate. The knight cannot be captured by the white bishop because it is pinned by the black queen. Chess trap number 14. White begins the game by moving the pawn to e4, and black responds with e5, mirroring white's move and creating symmetry. Next, white develops the knight to s3, and black pushes the pawn to f6. It's a Damiano defense. Sensing the vulnerability, white wastes no time and captures the pawn on a5 with the knight. Black responds by capturing the knight with the pawn, thinking they've neutralized white's attack. However, white immediately moves the queen to h5, delivering a sharp check. Black block with the pawn to g6, attacking the queen and hoping to regain control. But white capitalizes on the mistake by capturing the pawn on e5 with the queen, giving another check, and simultaneously threatening black's rook on h8, and it will fall. However, if black tries to escape by moving the king to e7, white calmly captures the pawn on a5 with the queen, delivering a check. Black moves the king to s7, trying to find safety, but white quickly develops the bishop to c4, aiming directly at black's exposed king. Feeling the pressure, black moves the king to g6, But white doesn't relent and positions the queen to f5, forcing the king to retreat further. Black moves the king to h6, seeking refuge, but white responds by pushing the pawn to d4, reinforcing their position and preparing for an all-out assault. Desperate to counter, black pushes the pawn to g5, but white confidently pushes the pawn to h4, signaling that the h-file will soon open. Black develops the bishop to e7, hoping to build a defense, but white shatters those hopes by capturing the pawn on g5, with the h4 pawn, a double check blowing open the king side. With their options dwindling, black moves the king to g7, but white calmly places the queen on f7, delivering a flawless checkmate. Chess trap number 15. White begins with pawn to d4, while black pawn to e5. Without hesitation, white captures the pawn on e5, taking an early initiative. Black responds by developing the bishop to c5, setting up a potential pin and eyeing an aggressive stance. To shore up defenses, white develops the knight to f3, solidifying protection of the e5 pawn. However, black pushes another pawn to d6, pressuring white's central pawn further. Undeterred, white confidently captures the d6 pawn with the e5 pawn. Black sacrifices the knight, and white immediately captures the knight on e7. But black takes a dramatic turn, capturing the f2 pawn with the bishop and delivering a check. White calmly recaptures the bishop with the king, diffusing the immediate threat. But now black captures the white queen on d1, queen-less. Chess trap number 16. White begins with d4, confidently claiming the center, and black matches the move with d5, solidifying their control. White then advances the pawn to e4, boldly challenging black's center. Black accepts the challenge and captures the pawn on e4, creating early tension. White develops the knight to c3, immediately attacking the e4 pawn, but black develops the knight to s6, providing sturdy defense. White pushes the pawn to s3, putting further pressure on the e4 pawn. Black captures on s3, creating an open file. White calmly recaptures the pawn with the queen on s3. Black seizes the opportunity to capture the pawn on d4. White develops the bishop to e3, attacking black's queen while preparing to castle queenside. Black slides the queen to b4, creating a threat to white's b2 pawn and maintaining an aggressive stance. White castles queenside, placing the king in safety and activating the rook on d-file. Black develops the bishop to g4, attacking the white's queen and pinning to the white's rook. Unfazed, white develops the knight to b5, sacrificing the queen. Black captures the queen on f3 with the bishop, seemingly gaining a decisive advantage. However, white delivers the stunning move nc7, giving a checkmate. The knight attacks black's king, and rook is in the d-file, leaving nil escape, and securing a brilliant victory.
If you enjoyed these traps and want more ways to win games before move 10, hit like and subscribe. Comment which trap was the nastiest, and which one you're definitely trying online later today. And remember, beginner chess is not about perfection. It's about surviving long enough to set a trap. See you in the next one.